Now that we've got a better understanding of what a type is, let's dive a little bit deeper into the subject and then discuss why we care about types at all. All right, so first off, a couple examples of some very basic types. So anytime that we are working with a value that has a type of string, we would expect to see a value that look like these right here. So if I have a value that looks like hi there, that is a string. If I see a value that looks like a string with no characters, that is also a string. And something that says today is Monday, yep, that's a string as well. Likewise, if I've got some really small decimal number, that's a number. A negative number is a number, and a really large number is a number as well. And the reason I break out number right here is that in some other languages, there are actually subtypes of numbers. So for example, in other languages, you might have a type to represent numbers that have a decimal, or you might have another type to represent a number that is only an integer and therefore doesn't have a decimal. In JavaScript, or excuse me, in TypeScript, we have nothing like that. A number is a number regardless of whether it is positive, negative, has a decimal, doesn't have a decimal, they're all numbers. If we have a value of true or false, we would say that its type is Boolean. And then remember, we are not only restricted to these basic types right here. Every value in TypeScript has a type. So for example, if we made a new date object, the resulting object from that would have a type of date. And then if we had an object that had an ID, a completed flag, a title flag, we would say that that is an object that has type to do. And this one only applies if we were working in a code base that had defined this interface right here. Remember, this interface defined a new type. Okay, so now that we've seen some examples of different types, let's talk about how all these types kind of relate to each other. So in the world of TypeScript, we have two different categories of types. We have primitive types and object types. Primitive types are all the very basic types that you might guess. So like numbers, strings, Boolean, null, undefined, and then symbol and void are two others we'll talk about later on. The other category we have access to are something called object types. And these are essentially any types that you and I create or any other types that are built into the language itself. So for example, all the different functions that you and I create are going to have their own type. And those are an object type. Any class you and I create is going to have its own type. Same thing with arrays and objects as well. Now, why is there the divide here? Like, why are there two categories, one called primitive types and one called object types? Well, the true answer to this we won't quite see until later on, but just as a quick preview, we say that there's a separate category called object types right here, essentially because you and I can write some code that will essentially trick TypeScript into believing that one value is a different type. I know that sounds really confusing right now, but essentially we can kind of sometimes trick the TypeScript compiler in a very good way. We can do that with object types only. We cannot do that with primitive types. So that's why we have these two separate categories. Again, I know that's confusing to hear right now. I just want you to understand why you will sometimes see these broken out into the two separate categories. Okay, so now that we understand a little bit more about types, on to the last big question here. Why do we care about types at all? If I had to answer that, I would say that there are two big reasons. The first one is that types are used by the TypeScript compiler to analyze our code for errors. So think about the definition that we just gave for types. We just said that types are an easy way to refer to the different properties and functions that a value has. Okay, just keep that in mind for a second. While you keep that in mind, I'm going to flip back over to my code editor and take a look at the code that we just wrote a little bit ago. So inside of here, we defined a new type. We said that we had a new type inside of our application called to-do. And a to-do is only ever going to have the properties ID, title, and completed. Then down here on line 12, we said that the variable to-do was going to refer to an object of type to-do. So that means that the object that this variable refers to is only ever going to have these properties. The TypeScript compiler can use that information. So if we start to refer to some property on that to-do variable that doesn't exist, TypeScript is going to throw an error at us. TypeScript knows that this variable refers to an object that has these properties and nothing else. So if we try to reference some other property, there must be something wrong with our code, and TypeScript can discover that and tell us that in the form of an error. So that's why we generally care about types. The other big reason that we care about types, back over here, one more, is that it allows other engineers to understand what values are flowing around in our code base. If you've ever worked on a large JavaScript project before, you might have ran into the scenario where you open up some file and you see some function in there with some really unclear argument name, like maybe a function with an argument name of like the letter A and nothing else. In that case, on a large project, it might be really hard for you to understand what that function is doing. If we instead try to annotate the type of arguments being passed into a function by labeling the types, then that at least gives other engineers some idea of what type of data is flowing around inside of our application. And ultimately, it will make it slightly easier for other engineers to understand what our code is doing. So that's why we care about types. Let's now take a quick pause right here. When we come back in the next video, we're going to start to take a look at some more code snippets to understand what's really going on. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute.